She sneezed. Loudly. In the middle of the galaxy's most feared war tribunal, standing on polished obsidian floors soaked with the history of planetary conquests, under the unblinking gaze of 4 alien emperors and 200 armed guards, she sneezed. And then, as if the silence around her wasn't fragile enough, she muttered, "Allergic to tyrants." That was the first crack in the room. A few alien guards blinked. One tilted his head. The others remained still, unreadable. The emperors, however, stared at her as if she were a misplaced data pad. She did not belong here, clearly. They saw nothing more than a harmless little Terran woman in worn boots, a jacket too big for her frame, and a satchel hanging from her shoulder like a student out of place on a battlefield. She was unarmed, unremarkable, and according to the Emperor's smug announcement moments ago, a clerical assistant captured during the rebel sweep of Sector 9. She shouldn't have even been present for the questioning, let alone standing alone in front of the Imperial High Bench. The tallest of the 4 emperors leaned forward. His elongated face curled in an expression humans would probably call amused, if not outright disdainful. "You, assistant. Do you even understand where you are?" he asked, his translator hissing slightly after each syllable. She shrugged, looking down at the polished floor, feigning submission, then looked back up. "Sure. The galaxy's most arrogant echo chamber. Smells like melted plastic and ego in here." Another crack. This time one of the younger guards coughed. Was it a laugh? The Emperor's nostrils flared. He motioned toward a nearby drone, which hovered over her shoulder, scanning her with a silent red beam. "Her designation says she was assigned to Terran Logistics. Level 2. How did a Level 2 assistant end up in my war chamber?" The question was rhetorical. He didn't expect an answer. None of them did. That's what made it so easy. For over 6 months she had trained for this moment, for this exact posture, this script. The role of an irrelevant human woman with a forgettable face and a quiet mouth. No weapon. No title. Just a satchel full of nonsense documents, and a whisper in her ear that had never left her. Her brother, General Cashin Vale, the last commanding officer of Earth's fractured resistance, had died a month before her capture. Right before the warlords dragged her from the ashes of his command center, he had leaned over, blood leaking from his lips, and whispered 6 words that would define her life: "Wait for the gun, then speak." She hadn't spoken much since then. Not in the rebel camps. Not in the transport ships. Not even when the emperors ordered her fed and interrogated and displayed as proof of the rebellion's final breath. They thought her grief had broken her. They thought her silence was obedience. In truth, she was counting. Every hallway. Every camera. Every guard rotation. Every second. Every vent. And most of all, the rifle. She had seen it the moment they brought her into the throne chamber for processing. It hung behind the central throne, a ceremonial weapon forged from the bones of a subjugated planet, its barrel forged in Terran steel and inlaid with the name of Earth's first colony. A prize. A joke. A relic from her home, placed there to remind the galaxy what happened to those who defied the Dominion. It wasn't just a trophy. It was a functioning weapon. She had confirmed that 2 days ago when a careless servant dropped the maintenance specs into the data cache she was silently observing. That gun was active. Powered. Even cleaned weekly. And worst of all for the Emperors, it had no biometric lock. Just a glass case and 2 rotating guards that now stood behind her with slack shoulders and bored eyes, unaware that the woman they were supervising had memorized their breathing patterns. The Emperor stood and stepped down from his throne. His robe hissed softly over the floor. "You must be wondering why we spared your life," he said. She didn't look up. "Not yet. Your world burned. Your armies crumbled. Your brother screamed. And still we brought you here. Because you are nothing. A symbol. Proof of the uselessness of defiance. Even your war council abandoned you. There is no Terran resistance anymore." She raised her head, finally meeting his eyes. "You're right," she said. "There isn't a resistance." A pause. A single second of silence. Then, with deliberate slowness, she tilted her head toward the guards behind her. "Which is why you should have checked my satchel." Both guards blinked. One moved a half step, uncertain. She moved first. Her hand shot to the strap of her satchel. In one motion, the fabric unraveled, dropping a flare pod and a microcharge at her feet. The flash blinded the two guards as she lunged forward, rolling under the Emperor's outstretched arm, hitting the floor and springing upward toward the throne dais. Alarm screamed. Plasma weapons powered up. Too late. She crashed into the case, shattering it, and her fingers closed around the rifle's grip like it was designed for her alone. She pivoted as the guards opened fire, but the rifle was faster. 2 bolts tore through them before they finished turning. The room erupted. Nobles scattered. Guards poured from every corridor. The Emperor shouted for security lockdown. But she had already dropped behind the throne, slapping a magnetic charge to the power relay. The lights blinked, and the upper gallery blacked out. She ducked, reloaded, checked the rifle's diagnostics, and grinned for the first time in years. From her new cover, she heard the lead Emperor bellow in panic. "Who is she? Who authorized her?" The room began to tilt toward chaos. She stood, exposed, plasma rifle raised. "I told you," she said calmly, her voice carrying over the noise. "I'm the assistant." The last word snapped off like a trigger. And then the throne room burned. A single bolt sizzled past her head and scorched the ancient banners lining the Imperial Hall. She pivoted with the rifle pressed tight to her shoulder, sighting the guard who had fired from the eastern arch. One breath. One pull. His helmet snapped backward and his body crumpled before the echo faded. She dropped to one knee, used the butt of the rifle to shatter a scanning orb that buzzed overhead, then turned and sprinted for the steps behind the throne. Her boots pounded over polished black stone as the Emperors howled behind her, shouting in their native language, a brutal mix of hisses and guttural clicks. Alarms erupted across the palace, and the lights turned red, strobing with rising pitch as emergency lockdowns triggered across the main levels. She had counted on that. She needed it. Behind the throne was a maintenance access door, disguised as a decorative column. She reached it, slammed her palm against the panel, and forced the override protocol she had memorized weeks ago during her silent walks through the servant levels. The panel beeped, paused, then slid open. She ducked inside, just before another plasma bolt ripped through the air where her spine had been a heartbeat ago. Inside, the passage was narrow, dusty, and lined with half-dead power cables. It was perfect. She bolted the door behind her and pressed her back to the cold wall, rifle still raised, pulse hammering in her ears. The satchel, now partially shredded from the blast earlier, still clung to her hip. She dropped to the floor, tore it open, and pulled out its true payload. No date pads. No admin logs. Just a single collapsible transmitter about the size of a small book, wrapped in silver cloth and sealed in rubber tape. She flicked it open. The tiny device whirred to life, its lights blinking in perfect rhythm. She fitted it against the base of the wall's wiring grid and connected a thin cord to the palace's internal feed. A moment later, her HUD on the rifle's screen confirmed connection. Earth's last war protocol chip, Oathfire, was active. She hadn't just come to kill. She had come to broadcast. The transmitter pulsed and encrypted signals began to pour through the Dominion's private relay systems. It didn't just carry her location. It carried coded phrases, directives, instructions, hidden in pulse and voltage that only a few scattered Terran operatives could recognize. Hidden warriors. Dormant rebels. People who had buried their identities under decades of submission. Engineers on far-off colonies. Mechanics on slave freighters. Cooks inside alien garrisons. Now, as her signal rippled outward through the Dominion systems, they received a message. A simple string of words, repeating over and over, impossible to detect unless you knew what to hear. The assistant is armed. The phrase had been agreed upon years ago, before Earth's fall, back when the Resistance realized brute force couldn't win the war. A new strategy was needed. Disappearance. Silence. Disguise. They had vanished into the Empire's shadows, pretending to lose, preparing to strike in one coordinated moment. And now, that moment had begun. From her narrow tunnel, she heard the stomping of boots above her. Hundreds of them. They weren't wasting time. The Emperors had activated the high-order response units, guards who didn't hesitate, didn't ask, didn't miss. She had maybe 3 minutes before they breached the hallway from both ends. She pulled a secondary sphere from her jacket, one of the last drone spheres Earth had built before their weapons factories were taken. It unfolded in her palm like a silver flower, lit with blue veins. She tapped its surface and whispered coordinates. The drone flew upward, passed through a vertical shaft hidden behind a ventilation grate, and soared silently toward the central spire. Its mission wasn't attack. It was sight. She needed visual confirmation that the signal was being received, that the sleeper agents were waking. She needed hope. While the drone flew, she patched into the throne's backup comm relay, routed from her rifle, thanks to a black market Terran fusion chip hidden inside the grip. The moment the relay clicked open, her screen lit up with dozens of low-band responses. Not words. Just tones. Just pings. But every single one of them meant the same thing. Message received. Standing by. A laugh bubbled up in her throat. She choked it down. There was no time for relief. Not yet. The guards were closing in. She could hear their boots clanking down the stairwell to her right, and the sharper, more precise rhythm of exosuits approaching from the left. If she stayed, she'd be trapped in the corridor. If she moved, she had one path: the ancient vaults beneath the palace, abandoned and sealed long ago, when the emperors no longer feared uprisings. But she knew better. The old vaults held power relays and escape tunnels, and more importantly, direct access to the planetary pulse beacon. If she could reach that and overload it, the entire capital system's communications would collapse. Dominion fleet commands, security chains, internal tracking, they would all go dark. And for a few precious hours, chaos would reign. She moved fast, sprinting through the crumbling tunnel and skidding down the ladder shaft that descended 4 levels. Her arms burned. Her shoulder still ached from the earlier blast recoil. But she didn't hesitate. She dropped the last few feet and landed in a cloud of dust. The vault's ancient doors loomed ahead, half open from disrepair. She slid through them just as the floor above exploded, filling the upper stairwell with fire and debris. The guards had reached her last location too late. Inside the vaults, it was quiet. Almost reverent. The air smelled like metal and mold, untouched for years. Glowing conduit lines pulsed faintly along the floor. She followed them until she reached the power core chamber. It was still functional, barely. She didn't need it to last. She just needed it to screen one more time. She climbed to the terminal, connected the Oathfire transmitter to the core, and initiated overload protocols. It would take 4 minutes. Maybe 5. But when it hit the pulse beacon above the palace, the signal would multiply across 5 sectors. As the core began to glow, her rifle buzzed once. Incoming transmission. It was video. Blurry. Shaky. But it showed a mining station on Varnak 4. Human workers, who had worn chains for years, now stood over a smoking pile of guards. One held a wrench dripping with blood. Another held a plasma cutter. In the background, a voice called out, repeating her message. The assistant is armed. She stared at the screen. Then at the power core. Then back toward the tunnel behind her. And she smiled, just once. Let them come. The tremor rolled through the ancient vault like the growl of something alive and furious beneath the stone. Dust sifted from the ceiling as conduits along the wall sparked, flickering between red and blue. She stood near the core, eyes on the temperature gauge, watching the overload rise steadily toward the critical mark. The palace above her was in full lockdown now. She could hear the alarm frequencies vibrating through the walls, layered with warning tones meant for Dominion command. But none of it mattered anymore. The message had been sent. The echoes were growing louder. Earth's forgotten were no longer silent. And she was no longer alone. She turned from the terminal and slung the rifle across her back as her boot crunched glass underfoot. The relay chamber ahead had once been a processing node, likely used for internal message routing before the Emperor's moved operations upstairs. Now, it was little more than an abandoned room with shattered screens and rusted beams. But it still offered cover. She ducked into it just in time to hear a grinding thud behind her, the sound of reinforced steel being torn apart. They were in. The guards had found the upper entrance. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe less. She counted her ammo. 3 full charges left. 1 burst cell. A few spare charge spikes in her belt, but those would only stall them for seconds. She needed time, and the only way to get it was to make them waste theirs. She slipped behind a bank of collapsed processors and activated a decoy node, setting it to ping at high volume from the opposite hallway. The noise started immediately, a burst of static and data pulses that would lure the first wave toward it like blood in the water. A few seconds passed. Then came the shout. One of the Dominion exo-units barked orders in guttural clicks. A second later, plasma bolts ripped into the far wall. Good. She slid into the darkness behind the vault's inner staircase, taking the spiral route upward, circling back toward the central chamber where the pulse beacon nodes still rested. If she could reroute the overload signal directly into the planetary beacon, she wouldn't just block communication, she'd trigger system-wide panic. As she reached the top of the spiral stairwell, she slowed, pausing to listen. The footsteps above were too precise to be standard guards. Not stomping. Not rushing. Calculated. That was when her fingers froze against the grip of the rifle. She knew that cadence. She had trained with it. Earth used it. Or at least used to. Back when Terran strike teams moved in perfect sync. The realization hit just before the new figure stepped into view. He wore a Dominion-crafted combat exosuit, but the shape beneath it was human. Too human. The helmet lit up with a projection, her brother's face. Same jawline. Same voice. It said her name, not as a threat but as a greeting. She stumbled back half a step, stunned by the familiarity in that sound. The Dominion had made a copy. A clone, a construct, or worse, an artificial mimic programmed with Earth's war history and combat logs. And they had given it his voice. She leveled the rifle anyway. Her hands were steady, but something in her chest cracked, like ice under pressure. The thing tilted its head. Spoke again. Said he had come to protect her. Said surrender was the only way to peace. Said Earth was already gone and that the Emperors had only wanted her alive to spare needless bloodshed. Lies. Laced with just enough truth to slow a heartbeat. She said nothing. Her eyes scanned the suit, searching for weak points, looking for proof that this wasn't real. That it wasn't him. It couldn't be. Her brother had never begged. Never offered surrender. And he sure as hell wouldn't have served the Dominion. The clone raised its arms slowly, palm out. No weapon drawn. Then it said something else. A phrase only he would have known. From the bunker, before the end. It asked her why she never cried when he told her Earth was lost. Her grip tightened on the trigger. The question was wrong. Not because it was cruel, but because it misunderstood her completely. She had cried. Just not where anyone could see. She had buried her grief under 1,000 silent hours and 4 million steps through enemy corridors with her head down and eyes empty. Because that was the mission. That was the only way to win. The moment passed. She saw the micro-delay in his balance shift, the pre-attack lurch. Too rehearsed. Too artificial. She fired. Not at his chest. At his left leg joint. The blast hit the servo motor, forcing him to stagger. She rolled to the right as he returned fire, plasma bolts hammering the walls. Her rifle's cooling coil screeched, heat flushing up her arm, but she kept shooting, aiming low. Strike teams were fast, but this one was mimicking her brother's style too closely. And her brother had taught her how to break it. She threw her last charge spike into the stairwell control panel, detonating it and collapsing the upper walkway. The clone dropped through the floor, landing hard on its back, momentarily dazed. She didn't give it time to recover. She leapt down, landed beside him, and drove her elbow into the side of the helmet. The screen cracked. The projection flickered. The voice stuttered. She tore the rifle up and pointed it straight at the core processor embedded in his chest plate. He gasped, voice corrupted now, spitting half-phrases from her childhood, mission logs, and battlefield screams. As if the machine was searching for the right words to stop her. But she had stopped listening. She fired once, dead center. The body convulsed. Then went still. The silence afterward was heavier than any scream. Her breathing slowed as she stood over him. Her arms trembled, not from fear, but from the storm inside her. The Dominion didn't just want to stop her. They wanted to rewrite her. To confuse her. To bury her under doubt. That was their mistake. They thought they could scare her with memory. But they didn't understand what she had become. She turned back toward the beacon room, battered and scorched but intact. The overload was almost ready. She connected the transmitter one last time and stared at the expanding radius projected on the screen. Dozens of pings now. Then hundreds. She activated the final burst. Every Dominion world in range would now receive it. A network-wide jolt. A coded rebellion signal sent from the palace itself. She wiped blood from her lip and smiled again. Let them try to cover it up. Let them explain to the galaxy how a Terran assistant broke their silence with one stolen rifle and too much grief to stay still. The signal hit the pulse beacon like a lightning strike wrapped in memory. Lights across the palace flickered, then died. Every Dominion system wired to the capital's relay stuttered, scrambled, then collapsed in waves. Panic spread faster than orders. Communications went dark. Security footage froze. Planetary surveillance blinked into nothing. And in the eerie silence that followed, the only thing that remained active was the encoded phrase still pulsing through the failing infrastructure. The assistant is armed. It wasn't just a message anymore. It was a virus, a call, a declaration. The lie they had built for decades cracked open in real time. The invincible empire just got outplayed by someone they thought was harmless. She stood at the edge of the control platform, overlooking the beam tower that funneled Dominion signals outward across the galaxy. It looked like a broken glass spine now, wires exposed, burning at the seams where her blast charge had rerouted the energy core into its base. Sparks rained from above as tech drones burst into flame midair, their wings fluttering like dying insects. Far beyond the tower's fractured arches, the first dropships began to rise from the lower cities. Not Dominion ships. Not anymore. Rebel markings painted in rust-red streaks. Sleeper cells? Civilians. Engineers. Dock workers. Pilots. They were rising, just like she hoped they would. A low hum shook the floor under her boots. Not the hum of another clone or drone. This was deeper. Mechanical. Coordinated. She turned just in time to see a squad of Dominion elites breach the far wall. 10 of them, all in jet-black exo-armor, moving like one machine. Their weapons were drawn, and they didn't speak. These weren't guards or interrogators. These were exterminators. The kind deployed when the Emperor stopped asking questions and started erasing witnesses. She ducked behind the control pillar as the first barrage scorched the air. She couldn't run. There was no exit. The beacon's backwash had fried the vault doors and sealed her inside. She had the high ground, the pulse of the rebellion at her back, but nowhere left to go. She knelt behind the column and reached inside her jacket. One last charge. An emergency pulse detonation, short-range and brutal, designed to fry electronics and brainstems alike in a 10-meter radius. If she used it, she'd take half the room with her, maybe even herself. But it would slow them. Maybe enough. Her hand hovered over the arming pin when her comlink cracked to life with a sharp buzz. Static first. Then a voice. Human. Rough. Familiar. We see your signal. We're in the air. She pressed the receiver to her jaw. Who is this? Flight 6 out of Deimos grid. Civilian retrofitted with stolen cannons. Didn't think you were real. I'm real. And they're about to breach me. Her eyes never left the advancing squad. I'll clear the roof. Come in hard. We're already diving. She didn't waste another word. She grabbed the charge and sprinted from cover, drawing fire immediately as the elites locked on. One bolt grazed her arm, searing through fabric and flesh. She bit down on the pain and hurled the charge into their center. The explosion was sharp and fast. Electricity surged across the room, and 5 of them dropped, twitching violently, their suits locking up as sparks poured from the joints. The other 5 adapted quickly, breaking formation and spreading out, firing in wide arcs to catch her mid-run. She slid under one blast and rolled behind a burnout control station, her rifle now little more than scrap. No more charges. No more weapons. Her ears popped from the sudden change in air pressure. A deafening roar followed. The ceiling exploded inward as the civilian gunship tore through it like a meteor, its underbelly bristling with jury-rigged auto-cannons and wing-mounted flares. The side door flew open mid-hover, and she saw 2 humans leaning out with rifles. One shouted for her to move. She didn't hesitate. She sprinted across the exposed platform, debris and wind whipping past her, as the gunners laid down suppressing fire. The remaining elites were forced back, unable to find an angle without exposing themselves to the rain of fire from above. The ship dipped low, its landing skid just close enough for her to leap. She jumped, caught the edge with her bleeding arm, and was hauled inside by hands she didn't recognize but trusted instantly. The side door slammed shut. The ship pulled upward, rising fast into the now chaotic sky. The pilots swore as they dodged plasma bolts and banking cruisers. Below them, the palace erupted in smoke and fire, its central beam tower now vomiting sparks into the clouds. She collapsed into the seat near the rear of the cabin, chest heaving, vision swimming. Someone handed her water. Someone else wrapped her arm. A child no older than 15 was manning a targeting console. A woman with synthetic legs was reloading a rifle. Everyone in the ship had the same expression. Anger. Hope. Fire. She blinked hard, grounding herself. Then she stood and moved toward the open side port. The wind tore at her jacket, but she didn't care. She stared down at the palace, now surrounded by rebel gunships and fire teams storming the outer walls. One of the Emperor's private towers fell in real time, crashing into a lake of shattered glass and steel. Above them, more beacons began blinking. Other worlds. Other uprisings. Someone touched her shoulder. The pilot. "What do we call you?" She didn't answer right away. Her name didn't matter anymore. Her rank had died with her brother. Her face was already plastered across every Dominion network flagged as a terrorist. But none of that defined her. She looked at the wreckage of the Empire's pride, now reduced to rubble because they never looked past the clipboard in her hand. Because they thought she was small. Because they thought she was just an assistant. She turned to the pilot, her voice calm and cold. "Tell them Earth sends regards." And then she looked ahead as the gunship peeled through the smoke and fire, carrying her toward the next fight. Toward whatever came after this storm. The rebel gunship streaked across the scarred sky, carving through clouds choked with smoke and plasma residue. From her place at the side port, she watched the capital city unravel like a cracked mirror. Fires bloomed in cascading rows across the upper sectors where Dominion command centers once stood proud. Civilians, free now, moved through streets like veins of electricity, unarmed but unshaken, pouring into the void left behind by crumbling authority. Dropships touched down near shattered barricades, unloading not troops but tools, food, field medics, and engineers. There was no anthem playing, no flags unfurling. Just movement. Just reclamation. A planet taking its first breath without a caller. The pilot shouted over the wind, asking for coordinates. She gave them without hesitation. Not to a shelter, not to safety, but to the Central Records vault located on the edge of the outer ridge. It was where Dominion archives were stored, their real weakness not in weapons but in their truths. Names of dissidents. Burial logs of disappeared colonies. Schematics for the weapons they had taken from Earth and twisted. That data needed to fall. Not just for victory, but for memory. Without it, the next empire would rise from the ashes of the last, wearing a different face but feeding on the same silence. She wouldn't let that happen. The ship dipped lower, dodging anti-air fire from rogue Dominion sentries still clinging to their last orders. She took the opportunity to rewrap her arm, ignoring the pain as blood soaked through the bandage. She didn't ask for a stim. Didn't flinch. The others in the cabin watched her now, not just with curiosity, but with the solemn weight reserved for people who had become symbols. She hated it. She wasn't here to be carved into murals. She had come with one mission. Finish the plan her brother had died to start. Burn down their illusion. Expose the bones beneath the gold. The gunship landed hard near the base of the vault, its landing gear biting into torn concrete. She jumped out before the side ramp lowered, landing with a grunt as heat radiated from nearby wreckage. The building in front of her still stood, barely. Its reinforced frame had resisted collapse, but smoke curled from its upper levels and the security grid was dead. She stepped through the broken main gate, boots crunching over shattered stone. Inside, it was dark and humming with leftover static from the fried systems. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It was thick. Unsettled. Like walking into a mouth that had just swallowed its last scream. She moved quickly, her memory guiding her through the grid. She had studied these blueprints for months. Every corridor. Every blind corner. At the heart of the vault lay a central node called the Mirror Room, named not for its design, but for its function. It reflected every lie the Dominion ever told. Inside were the files that rewrote massacres into administrative shifts, that rebranded rebellion as civil misbehavior, that turned heroes into ghosts. She reached the final corridor just as a sharp hiss echoed from ahead. A lone figure emerged from the smoke. Not armored. Not armed. He wore Dominion robes, a scribe's insignia on his collar, and his hands were raised in surrender. He wasn't young. His skin was marked by age and his face showed none of the arrogance she had grown used to in the palace. But his eyes, they carried calculation. He told her he had already begun purging the files. That she was too late. That none of what she came for would survive another 5 minutes. She asked him one question. Where was the fail-safe core? He hesitated. That was his mistake. She stepped forward and leveled the rifle, borrowed from the gunship's rack, at the back wall. One well-placed round blasted open a service panel. The old scribe flinched, stumbled back, and instinctively looked toward the left wall. She followed his eyes. Found the core. Before he could react, she shot him in the leg. Not to kill. Just to stop him from running. She left him there, moaning and cursing in a dozen languages, as she reached the core and connected her wrist relay to the terminal. The room flickered to life. Screens buzzed, systems flared, and lines of Dominion code filled the air. She began the data extraction. Simultaneously, the transmission of their crimes would begin broadcasting over every unsecured channel in range. She watched names scroll by. Thousands of them. Dates. Coordinates. Orders. She saw her own name flagged as a minor threat. Saw her brothers listed as terminated with a tactical strike. Saw her entire rebel cell reduced to a statistical inconvenience. She downloaded all of it. The weight of truth. The proof of survival. The old man on the floor begged her to stop. Said the galaxy wasn't ready. Said the truth would cause riots, civil fractures, entire systems to fall into chaos. She walked over, crouched beside him, and said the words she had rehearsed in her head every night since Earth fell. Then let it fall. She left him there as the mirror room continued to stream its buried truth into the sky. When she exited the vault, the gunship was waiting. But it wasn't alone. 2 others had joined it. Painted in makeshift rebel colors, some with scorch marks from old battles. As she climbed into the nearest one, a young woman with a half-burned face handed her a data slate. It was a message. A ping from Sector 12. Another beacon had fallen. Another city had risen. Reports from outposts she'd never heard of said the same phrase kept appearing in hacked feeds. The assistant is armed. It had become a rallying cry now. No longer just a signal. A warning. A promise. She sat beside the open hatch, legs dangling into the air as the ship lifted again. Below them, the palace was no longer a throne. The vault was no longer a prison. The city was no longer afraid. No one asked her what to do next. They didn't need to. The fight had changed. This wasn't about one woman with a gun and a satchel. It was about every hand that had ever been dismissed, every voice that had been silenced, every small thing that was underestimated until it exploded. She looked down at the rifle across her lap, then out at the stars. The emperors had ruled through control. Through fear. Through spectacle. They had lost because they forgot that power doesn't always come dressed in armor or cloaks or crowns. Sometimes it sneaks into the room carrying a datapad. Sometimes it smiles when they forget to check the satchel. Sometimes it sneezes in the middle of a throne room. And then it burns everything down.